Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So we're about to get started with this webinar. And so today we'll be speaking on unlocking NAP finance methodologies for adaptation project formulation. My name is Ziona Eob, and I'm the Media Communications Officer for the NAP Global Network. For those of you who aren't familiar with the network, the NAP Global Network is a group of individuals and institutions working to enhance national adaptation planning and action in developing countries. The network was created in 2014 by adaptation policymakers and practitioners, and it now connects over 800 participants from over 120 countries. Through our activities, the network facilitates sustained peer learning and exchange. We support national level action on NAP development and implementation, and we work to enhance bilateral support for adaptation through donor coordination with developing countries at the table. Funding for the network is provided by Germany, the United States, Canada, and Austria. The network also produces knowledge products like briefs, blogs, and guidance notes about the NAP process, and we work on a number of key themes. Today, we're going to highlight methodologies for adaptation project formulation building from evidence gained through adaptation planning processes. First, we're going to hear from Angie Dazé from the International Institute for Sustainable Development, who will introduce the issue and speak on the NAP process as a basis for formulating adaptation projects. Then we'll hear from Jason Spensley from the Green Climate Fund, who's going to speak on opportunities to support countries' adaptation planning processes, and specifically to strengthen the scientific evidence base for conceptualizing adaptation investments and designing high-impact projects. Third, we'll have Paola Pulido from Fondo Acción in Colombia, who will present methodological approaches for prioritization of adaptation projects. Finally, we'd like to hear from you during our question and answer session. Please write your questions indicating which panelist it's directed to in the dedicated question space on your dashboard. And so, to get us started, I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague, Angie Dazé.
Great. Thank you, Ziona. Good morning, everyone. So before going into the specifics about formulating adaptation projects, I just wanted to quickly review what we mean when we talk about the NAP process. This is a domestic policy process that aims to integrate climate change adaptation into development planning and budgeting at national, sectoral, and subnational levels. The NAP process is meant to be strategic in terms of taking a medium to longer term timeframe and promoting a systematic approach to adaptation. It requires a significant investment in coordination to facilitate planning and implementation across sectors and scales. As you'll see in this graphic, it can be viewed as an iterative cycle of planning, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. This cycle is enabled by things like finance, capacity development, appropriate institutional arrangements, and information sharing among NAP process stakeholders. NAP processes are intended to take a country-driven and context-specific approach, and they are expected to be participatory, to integrate gender considerations, and to take vulnerable communities, groups, and ecosystems into account. The overarching goal of the process is to reduce vulnerability and build resilience so that countries and communities are able to realize their development aspirations in a changing climate. One of the characteristics of an effective NAP process is that it serves to channel resources for climate change adaptation to the people, places, and systems that need them most. One way of achieving this is through the formulation of adaptation projects that can be costed and funded. So each element of the NAP process, as it was presented on my previous slide, can support development of concrete adaptation projects that can be presented in funding proposals. Here, I'm just going to highlight a few ways in which NAP processes can contribute to the formulation of adaptation projects. First, the NAP process generally involves some sort of assessment of climate change impacts and vulnerabilities, and this can help to articulate why particular actions are needed in a changing climate. By linking adaptation objectives to development plans and strategies, the NAP process can help to ensure that adaptation projects are aligned with and ideally integrated in broader development processes. Prioritization of adaptation actions through the NAP process can serve to identify concrete activities that can be included in adaptation projects, while NAP implementation strategies can provide direction on how such projects should be implemented including the most appropriate roles and responsibilities of different actors. The NAP process establishes mechanisms for coordination and stakeholder engagement, and these can be leveraged for development and implementation of projects. It can also establish or strengthen systems that create an enabling environment for project implementation. Examples here would include climate information services or agricultural extension systems. Finally, as the NAP process involves establishment of monitoring and evaluation systems for adaptation, it can support ongoing tracking of adaptation processes and outcomes beyond project lifetimes. These systems can also serve to aggregate results across different projects. While there's great potential for NAP processes to support the formulation of adaptation projects, there are inevitably challenges. I'll just highlight 3 key things here. The first is the tension between integrating and projectizing adaptation. One of the exciting elements of the NAP process is that it promotes a more strategic, longer-term approach to adaptation planning, moving away from the project-based approach which has characterized previous efforts to move forward on adaptation. A key objective of the NAP process is to integrate adaptation in development plans and strategies. So how do we ensure that project formulation doesn't take away from this? A related issue is the challenge of balancing process with progress. Undertaking a comprehensive and participatory adaptation planning process takes time, but moving forward on adaptation action is an urgent imperative. So how do we identify and package priorities into adaptation projects while still ensuring a quality process? Finally, one of the benefits of the NAP process is that it provides a strategic framework for leveraging and combining different sources of funding for adaptation. How do we coordinate the design and implementation of adaptation projects to ensure that we are maximizing the impact of adaptation investments? These are obviously not insurmountable challenges, but rather things to be kept in mind as adaptation projects are being formulated and implemented. To close, I wanted to highlight the main opportunities that I think the NAP process presents in supporting adaptation project design and implementation. First, because the NAP process generally involves an initial phase of stock taking and assessment, it can provide deeper, more comprehensive context analysis than might be possible in a typical project design process. This includes things like analysis of climate risks and vulnerabilities, as well as stakeholder mapping and gender analysis, among others. Applying this analysis in the formulation of adaptation projects can improve the quality of the project design. Next, using the NAP process as a basis for adaptation project formulation can help to place these projects in an overarching, longer-term strategic framework. This can reduce fragmentation, promote more efficient use of resources, and avoid duplication of efforts in order to maximize the impact of different initiatives. As I previously mentioned, the systems and capacities that are developed through the NAP process can support effective project implementation and monitoring, avoiding establishment of parallel systems. This can help to ensure that project approaches are institutionalized and that they draw on and ideally enhance existing capacities. And finally, the fact that the NAP process is iterative provides important opportunities for integrating the learning from projects into future planning. And this can serve to improve adaptation practice and amplify the impact of projects over time. With that, I will close and hand over to Jason, who will discuss the GCF's approach to strengthening the scientific evidence base for adaptation projects. Thank you very much.
Colleagues, it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to you. Greetings from late in the evening in South Korea. As you may know, the Green Climate Fund is a financier, a supporter of adaptation planning processes. I think we all appreciate the opportunity and the importance of adaptation planning to create the evidence base, the scientific basis for targeting adaptation finance, for creating the stakeholder, enabling the stakeholder engagement that's so important, and for catalyzing the large scale of financing required to really take action on adaptation priorities. So we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So In mid-2016, the Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC requested the Green Climate Fund to expedite support for national adaptation plans and adaptation planning processes. And since about 2 years ago, the Green Climate Fund has been active in providing these resources directly to countries at the request of countries through their national designated authority to the Green Climate Fund, or the GCF. And to date, we've received proposals from 74 countries, total of 75 proposals from 74 countries, and 27 as of today have been approved already. And the funds are now out for almost all of those 27. I believe it's 24 of the 27 that the funds have been received. About 2/3 of the resources, of the proposals and resources so far, are going to LDCs, SIDS, and countries in Africa. The total amount, as you can see indicated here in the slide, the total amount per country available as per the board decision is up to $3 million. $3 million that can be in one proposal or multiple proposals with different focuses and different delivery partners. Now, we see this as really an opportunity, a beautiful opportunity to really strengthen adaptation planning processes in countries. An opportunity when, frankly, our climate doesn't have a lot of golden opportunities. $3 million we see as significant for planning, but on one hand it's significant, but on the other hand, it's actually quite modest when we consider the scale of financing required to take action on the scale of adaptation priorities in any country. The needs, of course, are hundreds of fold larger than $3 million. So the big strategic question, and I think the main question for this webinar, is how to use these $3 million to catalyze the large scale of finance that's required for adaptation in any country, in any given country. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so just a little bit of a sense of where adaptation planning sits, the adaptation planning support window in GCF's broader programming cycle. It's actually before project concepts and funding proposals, which is where the large scale finance is for the Green Climate Fund. And for those of you who may not be aware, the Green Climate Fund is the world's largest multilateral fund dedicated to climate action in developing countries. Adaptation planning resources can and are strongly encouraged to be used to develop financing strategies that can include specific a pipeline of project proposals to the Green Climate Fund, certainly, and also importantly to other funds and other sources of finance, public, private, and other bilateral, domestic, public, other multilateral funds, and including the Green Climate Fund. So how can adaptation planning really drive the design of adaptation planning projects and other investments? Next slide, please. Well, there are four large areas of support that the Green Climate Fund can support for adaptation planning. Two of those four are represented on this slide. We can support adaptation planning governance and institutional coordination, and here you see a series of outputs. This is a menu of outputs. Each country takes or requests funds based on their needs, where they're at in their adaptation planning process. The second outcome area, as you see on the slide on the right-hand side, includes the evidence base underpinning the scientific basis required for for adaptation investment. The opportunity here is to really complete the gaps in climate information, the gaps in vulnerability, the gaps in understanding the climate impacts and risks, and then use that information for informing decision making, and especially in including actually designing adaptation projects, adaptation investments, to go again to a series to a range of different targeting a range of different financing sources. Next slide. I'm going to come back to this a little bit more in the use of the scientific information for designing climate project pipelines. I'd also just like to touch on the other outcome areas that the Green Climate Fund supports for adaptation planning, private sector engagement, and most importantly, or a key is actually increasing financing. The development of financing strategies, the design of project concept notes, and the systems for prioritizing projects. We're going to hear in a moment a leading example, an excellent experience in Colombia about a sophisticated approach to prioritizing project ideas and pipelines through adaptation planning processes. And finally, systems for tracking adaptation investment. Next slide. Thank you. So, as we're designing adaptation investments and specifically adaptation projects, it's crucial to start with an understanding of what really are the climate challenges that we're trying to address. What are the specific vulnerabilities, and what are the drivers of climate change resulting in those vulnerabilities? So we can then build through these steps to a strong project concept. These are basic elements that are articulated clearly through IPCC reports, and really all multilateral funds focused on climate are aiming for these elements, and they're certainly required in any GCF funding proposal. This scientific basis, the climate information required, obviously isn't easy, and sometimes it's costly. The strong encouragement or invitation is for countries to use the resources available through the GCF. Fortunately, we do have this golden opportunity that we referred to through adaptation planning and adaptation planning support to really develop the evidence base for designing pipelines with these elements. In understanding after the second key element, in understanding the vulnerabilities, exposures, and hazards resulting in risks, then it's crucial to design interventions or solutions directly to address these vulnerabilities based on options. And then fourth and importantly, the integration of the adaptation options and solutions into broader planning processes and investment opportunities. Next slide, please. What I'd like to show here is these basic elements of climate science for designing project investments, if you will, could be fleshed out further into basic steps for conceiving and designing investments. Investments targeting specific sources of finance, whether it's domestic, international, public or private, that really drive for adaptation impact. These steps we see as good practices and in emerging methodologies supported by GCF and undertaken by a number of partners. What are the climate drivers? What are the hazards? under step 3, what are the impacts and the vulnerabilities and the risks, to really building towards then therefore what are the solutions, designing the solutions based on the specific vulnerabilities, the specific impacts, and the specific risks, building towards the theory of change and onwards. If we start with a strong understanding of the climate hazards and impacts and vulnerabilities, then the interventions will be much more targeted to directly address the climate, the real climate problems that we're seeking to overcome. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is one of my the last images I'd like to share. If you're involved in a proposal to the GCF for adaptation planning, or you're considering developing one, there's a lot of detail in the what's called the GCF Readiness Guidebook on the key elements to be including in adaptation planning proposals, which can drive towards a pipeline of funding investments, including, but not exclusively to the GCF. Here are the 10 review criteria. This is a clear articulation of what we're looking for when we receive an adaptation planning proposal. Each of these criteria are detailed with good practices for each. I think that's Annex 3 in the Readiness Guidebook. As proposals come in, if they hit these review criteria, they go through quite quickly. Otherwise, they receive feedback, comment, support, feedback to address these. For example, review criteria 3, that the proposal really does develop a finance strategy for each adaptation priority, which can include specific project concepts based on the scientific basis for designing adaptation investments. Of course, the 10th one, very importantly, coherence and complementarity with other funds, not duplication of resources, etc. Next slide, please. So that's a basic overview of the opportunity for seeking resources from this particular window of support through the Green Climate Fund for adaptation planning. Again, a number of countries have already submitted proposals, 73, and 27 approved. We anticipate, and we're looking forward to receiving more. If anybody would like to have more information, please either, if you're not a national designated authority on this webinar, please contact them, or you're also welcome to contact the GCF Secretariat directly, and myself or other colleagues here, and we'd be happy to speak to you. Thank you very much. And now we're very fortunate to hear from a specific real leading example, as I mentioned earlier, in the country of Colombia, who has a very robust adaptation planning process, which started well before GCF support. And GCF's proud to be supporting the deepening of the process, actually implemented by Fondo Acción, which is a delivery partner, a national fund. The government decided to go with a national institution to implement on their behalf, and we're delighted to see how the implementation's going, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from Paola now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. Good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure for me to be here representing the NAP Readiness Program in Colombia. I would like to thank the NAP Global Network for this invitation, and the team as well. I'm going to talk about a methodological approach for prioritization of adaptation projects. I hope you can find interesting points from our experience trying to link our NAP existing documents and information to the requirements of funds like the GCF, as my previous colleagues, Angie and Jason, already mentioned. My name is Paola Pulido, and I'm a project specialist of the Readiness program. For the agenda today on this presentation, I will briefly start introducing the NAP Readiness program. Then I will give you some details about the NAP process in Colombia. And third, I'm going to the core of our presentation, and is talking about our experience in the process of prioritization. And finally, I will wrap up with a key message for you. Our program is a GCF Readiness Program for Adaptation Support. It started in 2018 and is implemented, as Jason already mentioned, by the recently accredited entity, Fondo Acción. This program wants to mobilize adaptation action in Colombia based on the existing NAP progress in planning instruments, current information, and successful experiences. The program operates in the base of three main components. The first one focuses on the institutional strengthening of the NAP structure that is composed by the Ministry of Environment, the National Planning Department, the Risk Management Unit, and the Institute of Hydrology, Meteorology, and Environmental Studies. By doing so, the program wants to catalyze enabling conditions for the NAP process that relates to the cross-cutting aspects such as institutional arrangement, information exchange, knowledge management, communication, gender, among others. It also includes the development of an integrated information system in vulnerability risk and adaptation that will bring together different key information sources for decision-making processes. The second component involves the participatory aspect of this program and is intended to engage relevant actors of the national and subnational levels with prominence of the private sector. It also looks for developing a useful toolkit for decision-making processes as well. Finally, the third component focuses more specifically in the implementation, supporting the building of an adaptation project pipeline with concrete outputs that refers to the formulation of 4 concept notes and 2 full funding proposals. Here is where the process of prioritization takes place. Now I'd like to introduce a little bit a general framework of the NAP process in Colombia that, as Jason mentioned before, started around 10 years ago. I would like to emphasize on 3 relevant NAP instruments that we have and we are currently using in the program. The first one issued in 2012, that is a conceptual framework for adaptation named ABC, Conceptual Adaptation. The second one is the roadmap for the formulation of regional and sectorial adaptation plans. And the third one is our national adaptation plan that presents strategic action lines for developing the process. It is also important and also connected to what Jason was presenting to us, that in 2017, Colombia presented its third national communication on climate change, which included a vulnerability and risk analysis of Colombia at the territorial level. This is basically scientific information that we need, and we need to learn how to use in our decisions. In addition, I also want to remark that from 2014, as you see in the arrow on the top, the gray arrow on the top, there have been developing many regional climate change planning instruments, and recently many other sectorial climate change instruments. And now getting into our main topic, the first question I want to discuss now is, why do we need to prioritize? And I want to answer this by bringing this information from the Adaptation Gap report, which says that even though there is an increasing trend of including adaptation issues in laws and policies, there is still a lack of effective and efficient implementation of actions. And this is observed in the increasing gap between the annual estimated cost of adaptation and the financial flows to cover them. This imposes huge challenges to countries, and particularly to developing countries that need to maximize profits and the management of climate risk in parallel with the accomplishment of developing goals. Furthermore, we have been encouraged to find a cost-effective adaptation, which means choosing strategic adaptation options and so wisely allocate resources and investment. In addition, we also have been told how relevant is to engage different actors in participatory process for gathering different views and specifically for the prioritization process. This is quite a challenge. I must say that we are not really certain about how the process should be. What we are presenting here today is a result from our own analysis under particular conditions from Colombia. Now, just going to the process of prioritization, I would like to pose this question, and that is related to what is really what we need to prioritize. When we are talking about prioritization, what type of actions, guidelines, or ideas, at what level, what would be our starting point? And the intuitive answer for us is basically to start from the foundations and strategic guidelines that our instruments have already developed, based, of course, on our own adaptation objectives. In our particular case, this refers to the document of the National Plan, National Adaptation Plan. As you can see on the slide on the left, you can see a schematic view of this National Adaptation document, which contains three main objectives for adaptation, a number of strategies for each one of them, and they are also divided into several action lines. However, we also have, as I mentioned, several climate change instruments at the territorial and sectorial levels that present a number of adaptation measures. These measures, in the context of Colombia, can be programs, projects, initiatives, or plans, which give us a wide range of options, even with different scopes. In this context, we might decide to either prioritize action lines or prioritize adaptation measures. If we choose to prioritize action lines, we will end up with selected lines that give us general orientations more useful to develop guides, policies, or strategies, but hardly projects. If we choose to prioritize adaptation measures, we would probably have to work on a long list of specific and concrete activities that therefore will require a more specific context of analysis. In addition, going for the adaptation measures would difficult comparative analysis between different instruments from different regions or sectors. Given this situation, we believe that could be necessary to identify aggregated categories that connect action lines to the adaptation measures and allow us to conduct a more standardized prioritization process. In our analysis, we have identified relevant elements to incorporate in the definition of these aggregated categories. For example, we have considered to include activities describing the action plan of the National Climate Change Policy, or information from categories in our MRB guide, as well as other technical documents. The idea is trying to propose a comprehensive categories to this process. Having said so, we propose in the frame of this program a prioritization process as an iterative process developed under different levels of analysis, national, territorial, sectorial, with different scopes and inputs according to the context of analysis. We believe that if we talk about the national level, we will be able to prioritize at the level of action lines. But at the regional and probably sectorial levels, we will need such aggregated categories that I already mentioned before. Going a little bit more in detail of the process we are proposing, basically we start from our planning instruments and diagnostic documents, and we want to end up with a pipeline of prioritized measures and formulated projects. To do that, we are proposing to follow these 4 steps. I'm going to briefly describe each one of them. The first one deals with a compilation of adaptation initiatives from planning instruments in accordance with their contribution to the action lines of the NAP, or to the aggregated categories, if so. The step 2 consists of the prioritization of initiatives according to their contribution to identified needs based on scientific information as our third communication and their articulation to the development goals, in our case, the National Development Plan that is currently in construction. Steps 1 and 2 will be developed in a participatory way, which also means to be sure that the relevant actors understand the methodological approach we are proposing and are able to analyze key information to use in a well-informed decision-making process. And I must say that this has been really a huge challenge to trying to understand how to incorporate this information in such a process. Step 3 consists of an evaluation of the enabling environment of selected adaptation initiatives, which also can be described as a readiness assessment. This refers to the level of support of an institution and its commitment to this initiative. In the same step, we intend to evaluate the level of robustness of the adaptation initiatives, which appeals basically to the reasonability behind the decision. The step 4 is basically an evaluation of the financial viability of more developed and robust initiatives. These two steps are currently under construction, for which we have reviewed relevant academic technical information. And based on that, we will define a set of criteria and, more important, a reasonable verification means for each one of them, considering that the level of decision is still not upon a project, but adaptation initiatives that might not have considerable level of maturity yet. And just for ending my presentation, I want to close by giving you a key message, and it's basically that our main challenge on this process, on this evaluation process, is to find a balance between the analysis of how the initiatives already address adaptation needs and development goals, their technical and financial viability, and the real availability of information and institutional commitment given their low level of maturity. To overcome that, we propose to frame the compilation of initiatives to those that are initiatives currently in place and want to be scaled up or continue in a next phase, or new initiatives, but with some level of information, background information, and of course, an institution that is willing to support it. For now, I think is everything, and I'm closing, and I will hand over again to Siona for questions, maybe.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks to our presenters, Jason Spensley, Paola, Pulido, and Angie Dazé. And we'll now answer some of the questions that were sent through the system. So first up, we've got a question directed at Angie. How do you identify projects that need finance the most, and how do you avoid the risk of selecting projects that are more likely to give good results versus those that need finance the most?
Thanks for the question, and thanks to the other presenters for the great presentations. I guess the question that I would have is, how do you define what good results are? I think really the first step is to define what are the most important adaptation outcomes that are needed from the actions that will be implemented, and which of these are most urgent. And this is where the NAP process can really help in supporting a process that does this in a strategic and systematic manner. I think, you know, the process of how decisions are made is really critical here in terms of, as Jason flagged, what are the types of information and analysis that are informing the project design? What are the criteria for prioritization? And I think Paola's presentation really spoke to this. And particularly, who is at the table when decisions are made? And I think, you know, this being a participatory process that is inclusive of vulnerable people, that is gender balanced, all of these issues are really important in defining what gets prioritized. And I think just to close in terms of identifying the projects that need finance most, it's also really important to map what's already going on. You know, NAP processes are not the first effort towards adaptation. In all of the countries that I've been working with on their NAP processes, there's ample experience, ongoing projects, lots of capacity that's been built. So in terms of identifying the gaps, I think we need to begin by looking at what's already happening and what's therefore available to build on. And I'll stop there.
Great. And we've got another question here. Do countries estimate or project the financing that they need to implement the NAP? If so, where is the information available telling how much financing countries managed to mobilize so far and the gaps? Perhaps this is a question for Jason.
Thank you for the question. It's a good one. It's really important, yes, that through adaptation planning processes, countries articulate the scale of the financing need and what are the strategies to get those priorities financed. Simply identifying priorities without a strategy and a costed strategy to with targeted sources of finance will have much less of a chance to get implemented. So it's crucial to have adaptation planning priorities costed and have a very explicit strategy for getting the resources, again, from blended and timed sources from the range of sources, including but not exclusively the Green Climate Fund. Now, there's also the design of the monitoring systems to actually track the amount of adaptation finance coming in and how it's being used. But those are, those I see as different, as different elements or even different activities within an adaptation planning process. One catalyzing the funds, the other tracking it and monitoring it over time. I hope that begins to answer the question.
And I have a question for Paola. Can you perhaps provide an example of a project that's simultaneously addressing adaptation and development?
For example, taking a little bit from our what Jason already mentions. In our case, for example, verifying that our initiatives on adaptation are articulated to our national development plan ensures at some point a little bit of funding, because what is represented in our national development plan is what will get a budget definition. Having said so, an example in our case, we have within our national development plan, we have specific components devoted to increase sustainability and even resilience. So, and there are other components that are more focused, for example, in agriculture, because we have, this is for us a very important line in our economy. And for example, to develop better practices or even taking care of seeds or native seeds, these type of things can help to producers to overcome extreme climate impacts, which is also can be an adaptation measure in some cases, and is also part of our program in our national development plan. Can be, it is not exactly the same, but the articulation between these two things can help us to try and to outline better projects within our development plan. And I think, I don't know if they want another question, if you have another question.
Yeah, we've got quite a few here. Well, I guess coming back to Jason, this is a two-part question, I guess. Did you consider submissions that synergize adaptation and mitigation? And also, is there any framework developed yet for measuring the impacts of the adaptation project that the GCF has funded so far? Because often adaptation projects have development co-benefits, and if there were any challenges there.
Okay, so first on adaptation mitigation, the goal of the Green Climate Fund is a balance of support for adaptation and mitigation. To hit 50-50 balance or as close to that as possible. There are many different windows of support from the Green Climate Fund. Clearly, the adaptation planning window is for adaptation planning. So that really is, this particular window is for adaptation, but the large scale finance from the Green Climate Fund is through funding proposals, projects and programs. Micro project is up to 10 million. Medium scale project is, I believe it's 300 million. 50 million is a small scale project, US dollars, sorry. So that's where the significant funding is, and that's right now, we're aiming for the 50-50 target. It's slightly higher for adaptation and total dollar value, but there's actually more projects for adaptation that are being funded. And in grant funding equivalent, the amount is greater for adaptation because there's more of a diversity of financing instruments going to mitigation. So in short, the balance is the target, and depending on the exact metrics used, it's being met or nearly met. Now, in terms of benefits, co-benefits for development and sustainable development with climate, I think we all appreciate it's very hard to differentiate. Actually, one of the 6 investment criteria for the Green Climate Fund is climate impact, and another one of the investment criteria is sustainable development impact. And here we have co-benefits also with ecosystems and ecosystem services, with biological diversity, with other environmental co-benefits, for example. Clearly, I think a big part of the point, that said, it's really important to ensure that investments for climate and for adaptation really are addressing key vulnerabilities and key climate impacts and risks. For example, classic example, we often receive proposals along the lines of we need some income diversification support because people are moving to the city from rural areas in the context of climate change, said very loosely. And that's very hard for us to define, because clearly we need to know what really is the climate hazard that we're trying to address. What's the vulnerability? Is more severe and prolonged drought, and let's back that up a little bit with some climate information, with some science about what is that prolonged and more severe drought, and making it hard for people to grow food, therefore to have an income from agriculture, and so therefore they're going to the city. Well, the different solutions to those different problems might be quite different. The solution could be better irrigation systems, and that might have more direct impact depending on a cost-benefit analysis. That could have more direct impact in addressing the climate vulnerability of prolonged and severe drought, as opposed to an income diversification stream. Now, both will have environmental and other development co-benefits. And that, again, that information and that science to do that analysis, we can, and we encourage building that evidence base, if you will, using adaptation planning processes to really design that, let's say, climate logic. Recognizing the fact that, look, climate and development are almost inseparable in a lot of ways. It's just that the main point is, from Climate Fund's perspective, is let's ensure that adaptation investments are addressing adaptation problems directly. I hope that helps.
Yeah, so I'll just address one last question to Paola before wrapping things up. Are there any experiences of sharing the knowledge and progress made by Colombia in climate adaptation with other countries from Latin America?
Pardon, can you repeat me? I didn't get it completely.
Are there any experiences of sharing knowledge and progress made by Colombia in climate adaptation with other countries in Latin America?
I'm not really well informed about that, but I really know that we have a monitoring adaptation platform that it's been developing and discussing about indicators for adaptation. And I know that they are also working together with other countries. Particularly, I know that 1 week ago, I guess, there was a meeting in Peru, and they were discussing about these type of things. Regarding the information system, if the question is more on this side, I'm not sure about that, because we are, as I said, in the program, we are supporting the developing of this integrated system of information, and we are trying now to figure out how to bring together all our own sources of information and bring them all together in order to provide key information for climate change decisions. So in the other side, I really don't, I'm not sure about the other thing.
Great. Well, thanks again to our presenters for joining us today. And for anybody interested who wasn't able to join, or in case you'd like to watch it again, we've recorded this webinar and we'll be posting it on our website along with all the slides. So I understand there were some technical difficulties, and hopefully that'll help resolve those issues. At the end of this webinar, there's a short evaluation survey that should launch as soon as it ends, and it'll be shared also in a follow-up email to participants. And we'd greatly appreciate it if you could just take a couple of minutes to share your feedback. Lastly, before we close, I just want to give you a quick sense of how you can get involved with the network. A first step would be to register online as a participant. It's free, open to everyone, and can be done on an individual basis. We keep participants up to date with our webinars and other activities, recent publications and knowledge products, as well as NAP-related news more broadly. Participants working for developing country governments can also access short-term targeted technical support through our country support hub and get involved in peer learning and exchange through our South-South peer exchange program. Bilateral donors participants can also collaborate with us to share information on where you're working, coordinate with other donors, and participate in network meetings and activities to learn from other donors and partner countries. As always, don't hesitate to be in touch over email. And if you have any questions or are interested in learning more about getting involved in the NAP Global Network, don't be shy, please reach out. Thanks again and have a good rest of your day.